And we're going to kick off, I guess one of the first questions from the panels was, do we even want treaty? So when each of you go through, and I'm going to give you sort of 5 minutes each just to give a quick cap before we start asking questions. But I need you to answer that question. Do people want treaty from your group? And what were the things that they think we need to do next? What was the 1 or 2 steps they think we need to do next to enact that? Go, Catherine.
Look, I think the overwhelming feeling was yes, people wanted treating. I don't think it's as simple as going, what are the next 2 steps? Yep. Because essentially what people were doing was doing a bit of truth-telling. And while I say maybe we don't talk about the couple of things that go next, maybe that is the God's honest truth is the first thing that happens is truth-telling. So our mob talked about treaty in terms of what the local lived experience was at this particular time, not only in how we're living today, but how we came to be who we are. Now, the words used to describe that were differently, but at the heart of everything were concepts of human rights. So do you have the ability to sleep in a house? Do you have the ability to access transport and communications? Do your children have access to education? Concepts like that came through a lot. Also the recognition, and again, when we're talking about human rights, the concept of recognizing how fundamentally important and how sophisticated traditional law and systems were. There was also a lot of conversation that was rooted in, well, where does the current government expenditure go, and who determines what that government expenditure should look like and what services communities actually need. Now, I am synthesising this. This isn't the language that was used. It was all described in local-led stories. There was also a lot of conversation about who should lead this particular piece. There was recognition that the land councils play a vital role, but there was also recognition that it needed to be broader than land councils and that other forms of self-determination should help create the space for those stories to come forward. But I think at the heart of it was the need to be able to have everyone's stories heard and the ability to speak to a genuine lived experience.
Fantastic. Peter, what did your group say?
The consensus was that there should be a treaty, but obviously there's a lot of considerations of issues around it and sensitivity, and quite legitimately question of the fact that historically there's been many major statements from First Nation communities about relationships and about treaties. So the question of trust and the question of establishing the bona fides. The fact that you've had the Buyurkala Bark petition, and one of our participants had talked about the spear still flying as far as we're concerned, but nobody's really got a hold of it, meaning there's that, and of course the Barunga statement, and then of course the Uluru Statement of Hearts. You've had 3 major statements and expectations, and that basically reflects where there is a serious question of trust in the relationship and understanding the bona fides about that. There's also very serious concerns around the current political environment. People were concerned about the nature of how to frame this treaty. Certainly, a key part of this is the re-engaging with the community in a way that is able to provide the information in a very transparent in a very simple way that people can understand, given they're coming off the back of the failed referendum where a lot of people were hurt, felt very grieved about the fact, given that, as you mentioned this morning, the majority of communities in the Territory had voted overwhelmingly in support of the voice. So people were very concerned that the people in the communities might be a little bit wary about that hurt as well, and to know that it might be just another kind of process of engaging in a highly volatile and fuel kind of anti-Aboriginal sentiment and rights, and what that might mean, and so how to do that, what level of commitment. There's also the question of you've got the Territory elections happening in August, and you've also got the next federal election in 2025. What level of guarantees? Obviously, that's a difficult question to answer with the nature of politics being the way that they are. But I think And there's some very basic questions of ensuring adequate representation and following kind of cultural ways and the imperatives that drive custom and culture and the protocols that go with it to ensure that that's built in early into the system. So it's not just a kind of lip service thing and talk about it as being manifested once a treaty is negotiated. But how do we try and work concurrently to be able to build capability? How do we be able to build understanding so that people can feel that there is some level of confidence? I think that the general feeling in the room, if I might say, I think was very positive and very encouraging, but have also very genuine concern about the realities, the political realities mainly, and in terms of what are the kind of trust and bona fide issues that should be laid on the table. And that relates to the questions you asked, particularly about what are the next step pathway forwards? What can the government do to demonstrate the nature of that commitment?
Thanks, Peter, and thank you to the groups that have contributed to that conversation already. Donna, what did your group say?
Thanks. Yes, our group wasn't entirely bought on the notion on treaty itself until we started unpacking. We pretty much had to get to the unpacking before we could even consider just going with treaty. There was just a reservation about it. So our group was spoke in very cultural, and very, respectful, and we pretty much felt that cultural protocol should underpin any form of treaty, and it be guided, whatever is within that framework, be guided by those earlier examples where leaders, advocated and pushed and fought for treaty alongside land rights. So yeah, it was more of a cautious approach, not rejection. So we really got to the heart of local issues. For example, our communities. There was a strong sense that we should return to self-governance in our local councils, for example. And the examples were given of things were better before we didn't have control over our local councils. And I'm experienced with that, but actually hearing it so broadly from the group and different stories, but same thing happening. So that was quite a strong discussion, that by doing that, it would really speak to the self-governance and self-determination, my words, of what a treaty could provide, but also place in the hands of our Aboriginal councils and groups the ability to actually manage their own funding, their own programs, ranging from healthcare, health centres to trades within communities, offering trades and skills training, but also health services, everything that our communities pretty much want improved. And that was felt that it would actually, not just empower, but actually strengthen and build sense of pride back, as we have experienced in other times. Now, there was a big focus on, we kept coming back to it in different themes and conversations around justice and the need to remove mandatory sentencing. But also we had a broad discussion about, based on experience of our group, involved in, I was involved in, for example, the Aboriginal courts down in South Australia, but so many people in the group had their own story to tell around that. So, and how effective that was, having a council of elders or a couple of elders sitting either side when judgment was being made on specific or particular crimes or, law breaking. And we talked about the effectiveness of that. So it's kind of taking back control of that side. Why? To reduce the incidence of incarceration of particularly our youth. And we kept coming back to 102% incarceration rate in our jails in the Northern Territory. So that. Oh, and also alongside that, the ability for that, having those Aboriginal elders or representatives, and a return to a form of customary law that some of us are also familiar with, which is a cultural practice, which is just not which is more of a learning as well as punishing, but quite seriously. So justice in the sense of that. I should have said this at the outset. Treaty itself was a bit problematic, and some of the narrative, even the word narrative, we needed to pare that back to straight talk. Just speak to us, in a way that we understand what you're talking about, that we can relate to. So that was also quite an important thing. So, for example, there was a short discussion at the end about if we were to come up with a statement, well, why can't we do it like the First Bark petition proponents of that? And actually paint, instead of putting the word up treaty, and have like two panels, male, females, because the power in the expression of art and culture and law and language and dance and song, everything can be, from our way of thinking, would be able to reflect that. There was a huge focus on education. Because that was the thing that we struggled to really get to a point of explanation. What is treaty? So the questions were, how are we going to teach the little ones? How are we going to teach primary school, youth, ourselves, parents, grandparents? We all need... So from my point of view, it was looking at educational resources, media campaign, huge awareness before we sign up to anything. There was much more. It was a very in-depth and very broad, but very connected. But very grassroots. For example, some of the programs that some of our participants are involved in are quite mind-blowing, because they're employed to do deliver a certain service, but they find themselves as teachers in culture as well before going into those, health services. And I think that's just because more generally, when you're delivering a health service, it's a health service, whereas in some circumstances it has to be either explained in language or, gender considerations and things like that. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Donna. Thank you for that summary. I think we'll come back to some of those points. We'll move on to Mr. McAvoy and his group. Tony, how did your group go, and what were their feelings about treaty?
Okay, I think it's correct to say that there was a strong level of support for the idea that treaties should be pursued in the Northern Territory. There were some people who were unsure. I think there was one, maybe two people who I think really didn't support it, but everybody else seemed to be fairly strongly in support. We had a broad-ranging discussion, but some of the things that people were really concerned about that might be reflected in treaties are the need for our communities to be consulted and educated about the treaty processes and to have a good understanding, but also for the parliamentarians and the government to have a good understanding about what treaties were, and so that they knew what they were signing up for and could commit to it. There was a strong discussion about the need for the treaties to reflect First Nation sovereignty, and that sovereignty underpin the treaties. There was a discussion about how government and Aboriginal nations needed to be able to walk side by side together and learn how to do that, rather than government coming in all the time over the top. There was a discussion about the importance of the local decision-making and authority being respected in the treaty processes. There was some discussion about whether there could be changes to the Western legal system through the treaty process, and we had a bit of discussion about that. In terms of what should happen, there seemed to be broad agreement that a working group would need to come out of this process to take it forward. There was some support for the previous working group consisting of the land councils to be in that working group, but also to be a bit broader, including some of the local groups. How that was to be sorted out, we didn't get to the bottom of, and we could have spent the next 3 days talking about that. But that could be left to other people to work out. But the idea is that perhaps it should be a bit broader than the land councils, but not so big as to be unworkable. Yes, so I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Thanks, Tony. I had the privilege of actually walking around the rooms and listening to a lot of the conversations, and I also stopped outside for a quick chat with Annie Elaine, who spoke strongly yesterday about her leadership journey, and she raised this important issue, and we've heard this around education. And Catherine, I might ask you first, how important will it be for our young people to be involved in this conversation? Because from some of the feedback, a lot of our young people maybe didn't have the same voice or the opportunity to talk about what it looks like for them. And given treaty will help to secure future for us, I ask Gammon like I'm young again, but for young people, how important is it that the next steps include our young people, and how do we do that?
Education came through very, very strongly in our conversation, and it came through on multiple levels. So one of those was that we needed, if we're thinking about what our next steps were, that there were 2 speeds that needed to work on. And one of the speeds that needed to be accelerated was how we represent our children, what access our children have to concepts of self-determination, how we reframe the conversation relating to children at this point in time, and making sure that when we're coming up with, when government comes up with decisions that impact on children, that local communities are consulted so that they reflect the needs and aspirations. Now, those things included really, you know, what should be common sense, access to things like bilingual education, access to enough teaching resources, access to skills transfer so that local community-led leaders and practitioners were recognised in the same way that non-Indigenous teachers were recognised. Now, I know that's not quite what you were asking, but it's some of the depth of it. Again, when we were talking about education, one of the some of the conversation tilted towards, well, how do you actually talk to people about this at this point in time when we've been experiencing Trumpism? So even in rooms like Alice Springs, people are cognizant that any conversation is being interrupted by political ideologies. So there was a lot of conversation relating to, well, how do we explain this in simple terms? What is a treaty? And how do we talk to our children about it, but how do we talk to our communities about it? Give us examples of what those treaties could be, and give us examples of how we can use it so that we can not only engage our children, but engage our communities and families as well. So it was quite a... it was a very, very sophisticated conversation identifying multiple layers of education and the need to engage the whole of community at the same time.
Thanks for that, Catherine. Peter, in your group, you actually raised a conversation because people were talking about, okay, so if we can do our own policing and have our own legislation, how do we pay for that? And you talked a bit about risk and living in a world that says this is where our mind needs to be at. Can you just talk to that a little bit for everybody around what you mean by assessing the risk and taking that on, being prepared to take that on?
I guess it's the way we've been normalised in terms of our relationship with government currently and historically in this codependency way. We're largely driven by a kind of social deficit approach towards our rights and interests, and the way that that's actually delivered through the program and service delivery mechanisms. And the question of risk, I suppose, is what the treaty process offers is an opportunity to bring a perspective from the First Nations communities, from leadership, from the cultural system of elders and their authority, their ability to be quite transparent and frank about their positions, all the things that have been mentioned about the nature of the traditional and customary and cultural imperatives that continue to drive Aboriginal life, but under enormous stress, and we've heard that raised this morning, under enormous stress in relation to succession arrangements, the ability to facilitate the nature of some form of economic independence, a way to develop a more secure existence, rather than a kind of a hand-to-mouth arrangement under the program delivery area. And I guess the idea that everybody has risk, you can never guarantee anything. The question is, how do we, as a community, define our risks in the ongoing, socio-political, economic, environmental environments that we all operate in? We're talking about drawing a line in the sand, as they say, or shifting the kind of foundations, creating a new paradigm shift towards defining what the peculiar and particular characteristics of those rights are as it is defined by First Nations peoples themselves. So nothing's ever guaranteed. You go into a process of negotiations. You always end up in a situation, there's a thing called BATNA, or stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. It's a negotiation methodology developed by Harvard University, and they say that they used it to negotiate with terrorists. But they say the best way to learn about mediation negotiations is to negotiate with your kids, because kids don't have any boundaries. They don't know. They're not experienced.
They do not negotiate, Peter.
Well, that's correct. That's why you have to be clever to be able to give them something that's palatable, that's reasonable, that's understandable, and that's the hardest thing to do, because most of us always end up losing with our kids. But that's the reality. So the question is, you have to think, the parameters that guide the nature of engagement and negotiation in treaties are the kind of formal technical structures around the Australian Constitution, the nature of the particular legislations that drive particular relationship between Commonwealth and states. And that's the other thing people talked about. They talked about the need to have the Commonwealth involved from the beginning. And that needs to be seen on the ground. People need to feel confident that there is some level of security and assurance that given the formal relationship between the Northern Territory and the Commonwealth, federal government, that there has to be some assurance in respect to the Commonwealth's role in this and the kind of legislative regulatory regime that it currently dictates and determines the nature of what happens or what doesn't happen in the Northern Territory. And besides that, there's also the whole question of the finance, the investment, the question of any required investment in the process itself, any post-negotiated arrangements or environments requiring settlements, because the report talks about not just the UNDRIP principles, but the associated kind of realities and manifestations of these agreements. So I was thinking post, it's like, for instance, how many people actually thought about what would happen after the referendum? How many people actually thought about what if the referendum didn't get up? But even if it did get up, what do you think would have happened? If you look at the history of Aboriginal policy, public policy development, and the respective legal milestones that we've achieved, if I go back to, sort of 67 referendum, if I go back to the 1968 pastoral award wages, if I go back to the kind of Mabo decision, there have been other decisions in between, but if those major ones, tell me, what were we involved with in respect to negotiating the post-environment? Mm-hmm. What we were involved with in the planning, what we were involved with in decision, and what were we involved with in the execution of those decisions?
Thanks, Peter.
I just want to say, basically, from risk point of view, sorry, Naomi.
You're right.
But I just want to say we need to understand better
what will happen, what
risk is, and if we understand it, then we need to be able to own that risk, because there will be disappointment along the way, but there will be greater understanding and benefit if you understand what that risk is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, part of that conversation that Kath was sharing with us that I heard strongly right across all groups around education for our young people as well, starts to reduce that risk the more that they understand the political environment they're working in and what treaty means. Donna, going back to a couple of the statements you were making earlier around the Barunga statement, obviously there's the Larrakia petition. We've got all of these things that we want to sort of carry on from. How do we not... So we heard, I think it was Garth from Maningrida, he talked about my ancestors, they threw the spear and it's still going. We never put it down and said we weren't going that way. So the journey is still going. But how do we not get the spear and take it back? What is the plan to move it forward? So it's all great to redo the Barunga statement, but is that still right for now?
Well, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. We wanted to honour those sacred documents and statements and efforts since the 60s. And there was a very, very considered and respectful discussion about that, because each and every one of us, from what I could, pick up, very passionate, thinking about the risk, ensuring that the cultural values, protocols, practices, imagining what it would have been like for those very wise and very exhausted, I would imagine, leaders from those times, the effort that would have gone into getting to the point where you're actually, going to Parliament or sending a petition off to the Queen of England. There was consideration of the health and well-being of our people, of our youth, and of our elders right now who, haven't got a clue, not through their own inability, but our inability to have explained that to them, what these terms mean. So, in essence, cultural protocol, respect for our elders, and I'm just going to jump sideways to say transfer of those skills, knowledge, experience for one of our members, participants, Gus Williams. Oh, I hope you don't mind me mentioning that. But had all these wonderful skills and this cultural knowledge and language and everything else, but missed out on a job in his later years for someone else simply because he didn't have a piece of paper. So we have got to, those doctrines, treaty doctrines,
Build on those.
they're just, they're precious and so sacred. So we have to also honour our existing elders.
Yeah, definitely.
And the young ones. We had a young one here who does all this training and extraordinary things. I'm not sure what age he is, but doing all this TAFE training and is training people from overseas.
I know.
So,
Always happens.
Recognise it.
Thank you, Donna. And Tony, we'll get to your question, audience, and then we'll come to you and we'll get some participation in. Tony, obviously you wrote the report, you managed the writing of the report and the recommendations, and part of that was the Treaty and Truth Commission being stood up, and we know that's not there right now. I wanted to ask you a question about it, and maybe so you can tell us more about what that looks like and feels like. Is it a government organisation, the Truth and Treaty Commission? Is it a section of government? Is it a statutory authority or an independent? And how does it work to enable treaty from the community? And you got 2 minutes now. No, you're right. I'm only kidding. You're so serious,
Yes.
Tony.
Well, thank you very much. Yes. Look, I just... one way of describing it, I was at an event in Darwin a couple of years ago for a domestic violence, family violence breakfast, Ochre Ribbon Day, I think. And there were a couple of speakers from ARDS and Member of Parliament for Mulka, Yinia Goyla was there. And somebody was talking about, and I can't remember who it was, but one of them, I think it might have been Yinia there, talking about this role that they have in their way, which is a person in the community that acts as a mediator, but is a bit more forceful than that. They have a conciliation type role where they can kind of tell people what to do, which is a bit more than a mediator. And the term that they use for that person, and I must say this wrong, but it was Mparntwe, and that role of directing the mediation, of directing the negotiations is a sort of role that I had in my mind for what this Treaty Commission might do. It stands between government and mob. It's not in either camp, but should be respected by both camps and should have enough power to push things along and push along the agreements. So that's what I saw it doing. And I imagine that there might be three treaty commissioners and then also some truth commissioners to particularly pursue the truth-telling process, because that needed specialist attention early on, I thought. And so that's what we've put in the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. We're going to go out now just for people to ask some questions. We've got about 15 minutes. Before then, I'll do a final wrap-up. We've had a fairly clear commitment to pursuing treaty, which is really great. Do you want to ask anybody some questions here or make a statement that the experts can comment on. And if you keep your statement really succinct, it'd be great because then we can get more people in. So who'd like to kick us off? Auntie Elaine at the back. Everyone's tired, see, you had afternoon tea, and that's when I want to go and have a little sleep. In my office under my desk, don't tell anyone.
I'd just like to ask Catherine, because I was in the room with Catherine and a group of us was there. And when we talk about our youth and children are two different things, you know, youth they're adults now. They live in an adult world, you know, and we can't speak down to them. They're our next leaders that are coming up to stand beside us. And the more we call out for them, we've outbound spoken again. And you heard that young fella in there, how he shared that truth-telling. He cried in there. And the reason why I wanted to say this, because like he said, you should know, Auntie, it was your sister that grew me up. So how did I feel there, sitting there listening to that? Yes, I cried with him. And I was hoping that he can come and... Come on, Rick. Yeah, come on. He was good.
And again, that story was part of the truth-telling process. It is why the truth-telling process is so, so important.
I just told a story, that's all. Growing up here in Alice Springs, one was about Kringle Flats. Kringle Flats was like Prince Charles or someone lived there when I was a kid. That's how flash it was. Now you go there, it's like a bomb went off, you know? It's wrecked. Yeah. And I camped at every camp except Little Sisters and Morrissoak, too scared Morrissoak, called the Kugel there, when you're a kid. Yeah, and all the families that I looked after, but all the old people in heaven now, you know. And my grandma's name was on the list for houses, not allowed to get it, LCAs, you know. My grandmother, her name was there. A couple of other people all got said yes. I didn't say this, but yeah. Yeah, just the way we grew up, and, you know. I get called Ballanda in my work, but I just tell them I'm not Ballanda, I'm half caste, you know. You know, I'm not full blood Aboriginal. I'm not white man, I'm half caste Aboriginal, you know. That's how I look at it. That's how we've been taught that, you know. I can't speak for anyone else, I just speak for myself. And football was my medicine. Football's all I had, you know. Yeah, and yeah, just about it. And, you know, my mother was an alcoholic, but I wouldn't change the world who I am from her, you know. She's my mother. And when you're playing footy, you see them ads on TV about them kids. Well, I was one of them kids. You know, you get called your son up. Hey, your mother's alcoholic. Yeah, well, her son trashing your son, you're playing football, you know. They give it to me and I gave it back. I had a mouth, you know. These things, I can't really do this stuff. I just went in there with Catherine and you felt a little bit at home, you know, because she's from home here. Yeah. Yeah, Alice Springs. Alice Springs, you know, was Alice Springs, but I don't know what it's got to do with the treaty.
It's got to do with truth-telling.
Yeah, well, anyway, treaty will never, treaty or the referendum, whatever you might want to call it, there's always going to vote no, We're the no people of our country, That's us mob there, And you just got to fight. Get up and just fight. Martin was playing football. Now I'm living a dream and work and everything. Coach football. No one would have reckoned I coach in Alice Springs because, you get called a mongrel a million times like them kids out there. You think you're a mongrel, so you act like a mongrel, Then the last one, playing for Pioneers, but coming from the Gap, being a Gap angel, yeah, that was another thing, You're already branded again, People from the Gap now, I'd explain now because everything's evaporated, it's all gone, There's no Gap angels, there's no Gap, everyone lived everywhere. But, yeah, I don't know, I don't know what they're going to do with the treaty because I don't think we'll ever get that stuff anyway, you know what I mean? But if we come from overseas and we went to a meeting and talk, they'll listen to us, you know what I mean? I don't know. That's how I see it anyway. Yeah, they called us the lucky country. Not too lucky, eh?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Annie.
And that was one of the ways it was described in our room, was Australia is only a lucky country for people that come from overseas. And when you think about that, that means everyone who's not Aboriginal, because technically they all came from overseas. But that story, and again, my expertise isn't in law. My expertise is in community design and understanding why stories like that one are fundamental to getting a treaty process right. Because the layers that were described in that story are critical to understanding what elements are required in a treaty in order to get a successful outcome for mob. And also understanding in that story, there were some sad things, but there were some things of great pride. And that great pride that our mob have, we belong to Alice Springs, and that's what people said, we belong to Alice Springs, this is our country. We will be here, we were here before any troubles, and we'll be here after people move on as well. So I think, again, when we're talking about the ability for a treaty to truly land, it is the ability to flush out those stories, understand what's happened. And if I could apply it to, say, the Victorian example, when they started their Truth-Telling Commission, one of the stories that sticks in my mind is when they absolutely grilled the police commissioner, and they said, did you know that your services target Aboriginal youth? And they admitted, yes, we know that the police over-target Aboriginal youth. Did you know that the outcomes in your court systems are worse for Aboriginal children and Aboriginal families? And the admission is, yes, we are aware of that. And then the admission of, well, why is it okay? And no one can answer those questions. So these are the reason that those stories, fundamental stories, just the stories of the people who live and breathe being a Territorian, will be absolutely necessary to flush out if we're ever going to get any real value in a treaty process. Thank you.
No, thanks, Kath, and thank you for sharing the stories. I think we spoke yesterday too about truth-telling being not just about the history and the frontier wars and the massacres and stolen generation, but the stories of the now and how we are living today. And I think truth-telling has to be a record of what life is like to be an Aboriginal Australian, if that's what we're calling ourselves, or if we're just calling ourselves Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or whatever you're calling yourself from your nation. What does it mean to be that, and do we belong here inside? Any other questions or statements that anybody would like to make? Oh, here, look at the front here. You have to have the microphone, everyone can hear you.
I'll just say one thing very quickly.
Yes.
Those questions that were being asked of the police commissioner, I got to ask those questions.
And you loved it.
One of my better days in court, I can tell you.
See, Gavin's smiling now, but being serious to me. Yeah, I would have been happy asking them questions too. Come on now.
Just in regards to us taking risk, is the government willing to take risk with us?
What do you think?
I think that comes to, oh, sorry, just jump in. Look, I lean into the fact that this particular government has committed to a treaty process. Now, at this point in time, what we're seeing across the nation is many, many governments stepping away from anything brave relating to Aboriginal affairs. So we've seen even slight step backs in Queensland. We're seeing in South Australia a new campaign to lobby to undermine the treaty process. We've seen in Victoria, where they're really well progressed, we've seen the Victorian opposition government there start saying they're stepping away from the process. So I think if we're sitting in an environment at this point in time where a government is saying, move forward, we're going to commit to this process, I think it shows extraordinary bravery, actually, because there is absolute risk in committing to a process like this, and we've seen the impact of governments taking that risk in Indigenous affairs recently.
Government's job is always about managing risk. And managing risk is about staying in power and getting the votes that they need to do it. And that's a very extremely cynical view, but it's part of the machinations of the political environment we live in. That's the nature of the way the process works, and whether we may not accept it, but ultimately it's how you are able to manage those risks that enable you to be able to deliver what the commitments that you say. So governments would fully understand that the nature of undertaking this is a political risk, but it also requires strident and significant moral leadership and conviction to deliver what's right, and that's what distinguishes governments. It's about what they know to be right and how they decide to pursue that with the level of conviction required. And you get various shades of that at the end of the day, but largely that's what the business of risk is.
And I think I'm going to jump in again, and I'm sorry, Donna, I can see you lining up there. But one of the things also that we're observing internationally is a lot of people have started to say we're tired of governments telling us how things should be done. And voters globally have been leaning into governments that are braver, with governments that are willing to stand up and say, in actual fact, this is not about power, this is about delivering the best outcomes for our people. So there has even internationally been a push for governments to step up and do the right thing as opposed to just look for votes. Sorry.
No, you're right. I'm just going back to the early days. So we've experienced decades and decades and decades, and those advocates, those groups who were pushing for a treaty way back when, they always, like when I read all these statements, there's, well, it's going to depend on the goodwill of the government of the day. And it's kind of like, a real death knell on it with all the effort. Now, jumping over to what you just said, Catherine, I think, and a classic example of that is I was in Canada about 1.5 years ago and speaking about the importance of Indigenous-led environmental remediation on Indigenous land and sea country. So I'm going to the details. But the First Nations, I didn't realise First Nations Minister for Environment was sitting right in front of me, and she went back to the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. A couple of weeks later, he said, Australia is leading the way in Indigenous-led remediation, because of all the mining and stuff. So I'm going to commit $98 million towards it. And I was just eating breakfast and I nearly fell over. But you see, that's where that kind of brave new approach, I'm not sure if that actually, but that's what we need. We need that kind of reaction. And I think we've got the greatest opportunity, and we need to also be very supportive of our Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and Treaty, because, there's got to be a bit of work and done with to get consensus around treaty. So there's the risk.
It would be remiss of me not to say that we want to sound too negative with a negative note, but I just think I was just calling it as it is, and if we're mentioning truth-telling, well, that's a truth-telling thing. But the question is that the proposition was put forward about what's next. So suggestion was that the MOU that was signed by the Statutory Land Council of the Northern Territory Government in 2018, that be refreshed to negotiate the question of where to now in terms of process and the methodology for executing the recommendations of the Commission report. So that was a firm thing that came out with consensus. Everybody agreed with that.
Great. Were there any other actions that you, obviously we're in the red, any other actions that came out that we can collectively put back to the Northern Territory Government today? Tony?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I just might go back a step on that question of risk. I'll make this observation that in every state and territory where treaty processes are underway, the law and order campaign is still underway, and our kids and women and people are still being locked up. And I can't help but feeling that the government of the day manages the risk of treaties and truth-telling by offsetting it against kowtowing to the law and order campaigns that are run to keep locking our people up. Now, I know that just last week the end to mandatory sentencing in the Northern Territory came into effect, and that will change a lot of people's lives in the Northern Territory. I know that the Chancellor's attorney is doing what he can to try and follow through on the recommendations from Don Dale, but I know that this election here in the Northern Territory is going to be run on a crime and law and order basis, and it might be a bit cynical, casting it in that way, that we're having to see our people locked up in order to get treaties, but that's the way it feels at the moment, and that might be a post-referendum bit of cynicism, but that's the way it feels.
Trade-off.
So in terms of other things that we could do, look, there was a lot of discussion about the need for ensuring that there was cultural authority and elders' leadership in the working group arrangements, that there was consideration of the important different aspects of our communities, including men's and women's roles and age and the contribution young people can make and the responsibility of individual nations, clans to speak for themselves. So how you balance all of those things into a small functional working group is a difficult thing to
Definitely.
do. But it was clear that the workshop that I was in wanted that to happen and wanted it to move forward.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Donna, an action?
Yes, so for a treaty to have representative groups, so just to ensure that local language groups were having discussions in their own language, and that will be valued when brought together under an umbrella of a Northern Territory treaty. There's a whole big piece behind that, but briefly, the other thing was cultural authority, to make sure that the spiritual strength is embodied, cultural and spiritual strength is embodied in a treaty, and if we have to change the narrative and, you know, to reflect or possibly put into legislation, so be it. I wish I could remember them all, but there's in my group, strong emphasis on youth and bringing back respect and teachings and learnings from our people, our way, first, so that they're learning about the cultural heritage and cultural practice at the same time, because of the feeling and the fear and the risk of losing it altogether. So our discussion about treaty was more about what embodied those the values and the sentiment around those very early treaty petitions.
Yep.
That were images rather than a whole heap of text.
Yeah. Peter, your action?
Basically, in terms of what should be done next, obviously there needs to be more information about the treaty, but being extremely careful about the nature of the sensitivity about how that is delivered. And people are also concerned about the expected and obvious attitude that is there, that is current and will continue to be, and the effect that will have a people. I'm just referring to my notes. There's also the question of ensuring that it's inclusive and transparent to make sure that people who might live in the cities or towns and more urban kind of areas have an opportunity to make comment. There's that includes people like Stolen Generation and I suppose you call them, they so-called diaspora people who've moved away from country but might be living elsewhere. And even if it's not in the territory, elsewhere, how that's made available to them. And obviously a very clear engagement methodology with both territory and Commonwealth governments on the ground in communities, amongst other things. I think, hang on, we've got a book here. So I guess the other thing was that the group wanted the Chief Minister to make a commitment, a statement on the treaty. And that I mentioned the MOU, basically a revised treaty working group to work together to be able to.
2018 MOU?
Sorry?
The 2018 MOU that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, a new revised MOU between the government and land council to progress the next steps. Mm-hmm. And obviously the whole question of bipartisan approach to it as some level of bona fides in the consideration of risk in regards to the treaty and the MOU.
Thanks, Peter. And Catherine, we'll hear from you, like the one or two steps, if there were any.
Steps. First one, the education campaign. So our group was very clear that people needed to understand what is a treaty, how can it be used, and why is it important to the Territorians, but in particular, why is it important to each and every one of us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people living in the Northern Territory. So start the education campaign and build momentum and build support so that it supersedes any election campaign that comes. And I think if I root it into what Tony was identifying earlier, every single election in the Northern Territory is fought on a platform of crime and economic development, every single one. So we need these stories to supersede that. We need these stories to change the narrative, because if you change this message, you change the story. The other thing that our group identified was children. Do not wait for this to come into fruition. Start the campaign now and start it with showing how a treaty is fundamental for the flourishing of our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our amazing panel. We'll move into the final session, which is literally like 2 minutes of me saying some stuff. And this is where I get to say all the stuff that I want to say. And I know everyone is excited about that. But can we please thank our amazing professional experts, Mr. McAvoy, Professor Odegaard, Mr. Yu, and Ms. Liddle. Thank you so much for your contributions and your leadership today. We're over by, oh no, we've got 1 minute. We've had a lot of really interesting things happen today, and it's been a really hard couple of days for those of you who've been here for the whole lot of them. I think some of the feedback that I've gotten, and I'm saying this to the organisers and to everyone else, is how important it is that we don't just take a day where we've just got to sit and listen all day. We need more time to talk together and to hash out some ideas, but also to understand the concept. I think some key messaging for me is that people really don't know what treaty is and what it will do. People don't feel trust for anybody's commitment for that, but also that we've got to involve our young people and our old people and got to listen to all the things, and it's all of the things that we continue to talk about in Aboriginal affairs all the time. I think everybody is happy to support treaty. But what I will come back to is, we need that bipartisan support. We certainly want the commitments from, the chief and otherwise. We're really lucky to have Chancey championing this, as strongly as he is, that commitment to us and his mob and all Black Territorians. But we can't wait for government. And if we activate, if Black Territory activates, if countrymen activate collectively, then Chancey don't have to fight anybody in caucus. He don't have to convince anybody in caucus, because everybody will see. And if you don't know already, our student population will be about 50% Black within the next 5 to 10 years. We are literally the largest ethnic population in the Territory. They need our votes. So if we collectivise and change the narrative and get positive and think about our strengths, we look at the honour in those documents that Dr. Odegaard talked about, we think about the Treaty and Truth-Telling Commission and get that standing up so we can force some movement. But if we invest from country ourselves in these conversations to keep them moving, that's how we will push treaty forward, because it will be our agenda and not NTG agenda, right? We need it to belong to us. We need it to be wanted by us. And therefore, we need to do the actions and we need to put some dollars into. Because that's self-determination. Not government telling us what it will be and how it will be, but government, you better give us some money. It's us saying, this is what treaty needs to look like for us. And it's us making a plan to get the Ballanda, Kardia, Perakut, Migaloo, whatever you want to call them, on the team. We've got to get them on the team. And what we've got to do is we've got to go out and we've got to find all our bulldogs, all our deadly black bulldogs, and we've got to go say, sick them. Right? So let's get really strong. Let's do more talking, because what I know is our statement today that we will write up is yes. The Central Australian Symposium for Treaty and Truth-Telling said, yes, we want treaty. Yes, we want truth-telling. But the step next is education and more talking. And we're going to want to lead a lot of that. Would you agree? So the next step is more talking out in the regions and an education campaign to talk about what treaty could look like. And we also agree that it is more than land councils, correct? Fantastic. Is there anything that I've forgotten that absolutely must be added to the next steps for us? Because I'm going to Darwin on Monday, and you mob, normally Central Australia outdoes them top-end mob. You mob are always more staunch and angry. So is there anything I better tell them that they've got to keep up with? Well, they won't have, hey? Setting up a youth forum, bang, right there. They got no juicy rump either, so they're going to be missing out either way. That's all right, I'll be there too with my juicy rump.